You're a good mother, Margaret, but good mothers don't always end up with grateful children. That was the sentence my daughter-in-law said at the dinner table one quiet Sunday evening, and for a moment the entire room seemed to freeze around me. I remember the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint ticking of the wall clock above the doorway, and the smell of roasted chicken that had taken me 2 hours to prepare. Everything looked perfectly normal. The dining room was warm, the table was set with my best china, and the evening sunlight filtered through the lace curtains the way it had for nearly 30 years. Yet something about the way she said those words made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain at the time. My son Daniel sat across from me, gently turning his glass of iced tea in slow circles on the table, avoiding my eyes as if the grain of the wooden tabletop had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the world. Olivia smiled politely after speaking, the kind of polite smile that looks pleasant from a distance but carries no warmth when you see it up close. For a few seconds no one said anything. I simply nodded as if her comment were an ordinary observation, the kind families make without thinking. But inside my mind a quiet realization began to unfold, slow and heavy like a door opening in a house I thought I knew perfectly well. Because the truth is, when you live long enough, you begin to understand that certain sentences carry more weight than others. Some sentences reveal what years of silence have been hiding. That night, sitting at that familiar dining table in the house my late husband and I had spent 3 decades paying off, I began to understand something that would change the way I looked at my entire life. If I had learned certain lessons earlier, lessons about family, about respect, about the difference between love and convenience, my life might have followed a very different path. But at 68 years old, I was only just beginning to see them clearly. I had spent most of my adult life believing that devotion solved everything. I believed that if you worked hard enough for your family, if you sacrificed quietly and kept the peace whenever conflict appeared, eventually everyone would recognize your love and return it. That belief had guided nearly every decision I made for more than 40 years. I worked double shifts at the local pharmacy when Daniel was young so he could attend a good school district. I postponed vacations, replaced worn furniture with cheaper alternatives, and spent countless evenings helping him study at the kitchen table long after I had come home exhausted from work. None of those things felt like sacrifices at the time. They felt like responsibilities, the natural rhythm of being a mother. And for many years I believed that rhythm meant our family was strong. But families, I would later discover, can look solid from the outside while slowly shifting underneath the surface. The warning signs were always there, small enough that I convinced myself they meant nothing. The phone calls that became shorter each year. The holidays that suddenly required different plans. The way Olivia's voice always sounded slightly tighter when my name came up in conversation. I told myself these things were normal. Every family changes over time, I thought. Every generation finds its own way of doing things. But sitting there at that table, hearing her say those quiet words with such casual certainty, something inside me finally connected the pieces I had spent years ignoring. Because sometimes a single sentence can illuminate an entire lifetime. And in that moment, watching my son look down instead of meeting my eyes, I realized that the lessons I should have learned decades earlier were finally arriving. Late, perhaps, but clear enough to change everything that would come next. I washed the dishes that night the same way I had done thousands of times before, slowly and carefully, rinsing each plate under warm water while the kitchen grew quiet behind me. The house felt strangely large once Daniel and Olivia left, as if the walls themselves were listening to the silence that settled in after the door closed. I placed the last plate into the rack and turned off the faucet, watching the thin stream of water disappear down the drain. For years this kitchen had been the center of my life. Every birthday cake had been baked here. Every Thanksgiving turkey had rested on the same counter by the window. I could still picture Daniel as a boy sitting at the small breakfast table doing his homework while I stirred soup on the stove. Back then he used to look up every few minutes and ask questions about everything from math problems to whether he could stay up an extra half hour to watch television. Those memories had always felt solid to me, like photographs framed neatly on the walls of my mind. But that evening something felt different. It was as if the past had shifted slightly, revealing details I had never allowed myself to see before. I dried my hands with a kitchen towel and looked around the room that had once been full of noise and conversation. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The clock on the microwave read 9:34. Outside, the streetlights had already turned on, casting long pale shadows across the front yard. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to think about the small moments that had led us here. Daniel had not always been distant. When he was young, he used to run through the front door every afternoon shouting my name as if the world outside had been an adventure he could not wait to tell me about. I had built my entire life around protecting that sense of safety for him. When my husband passed away 12 years ago, I promised myself that nothing would change for Daniel. I worked longer hours. I learned how to manage the mortgage and property taxes on my own. I even postponed retirement so that I could help Daniel with the down payment on his first home. At the time, I believed that was what love looked like. Quiet effort, quiet sacrifice, quiet faith that everything you gave would eventually come back in some form of gratitude. I remember the day Daniel introduced me to Olivia. She was charming and confident, with bright eyes and the kind of polished smile that made people feel comfortable almost instantly. I wanted to like her from the very beginning. In fact, I tried very hard to make sure she felt welcome in our family. I invited them both for Sunday dinners. I helped them move into their first apartment. When they married 5 years later, I even used part of my savings to help pay for the reception hall so they could celebrate with all their friends. At the time, every decision felt simple. Family supports family. That was the rule I had always followed. Looking back now, I can see the smaller details that I ignored. The way Olivia sometimes corrected Daniel in front of me with a quick glance that seemed polite but carried a certain finality. The way conversations slowly shifted whenever financial topics appeared, as if I were being gently guided out of discussions that once included me. None of those moments seemed serious enough to question. They were just small changes, the kind that happen naturally when children grow up and build their own lives. That is what I told myself over and over again. Standing alone in that quiet kitchen, I finally understood something that had taken decades to recognize. The signs had not appeared suddenly. They had been there for years, quietly accumulating like dust on a shelf that no one bothers to wipe until the sunlight reveals how much is gathered. And that night, for the first time, the sunlight was finally bright enough for me to see everything clearly. I did not sleep much that night. The house had a different kind of quiet after midnight, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should be. The heater turned on once around 2 in the morning with a soft click, and the old oak tree outside brushed its branches against the siding whenever the wind moved through the yard. I lay awake staring at the ceiling in the bedroom my husband and I had shared for more than 30 years, slowly replaying the dinner conversation in my mind. The strange thing about difficult realizations is that they rarely arrive all at once. They unfold gradually, revealing pieces of truth that had always been present but carefully ignored. I began remembering conversations that once seemed harmless. Daniel telling me they might skip Christmas dinner one year because Olivia had planned a trip with friends. Olivia suggesting that the house was probably too large for one person to maintain. Small remarks that I had brushed aside because I believed families naturally adjust to changing circumstances. At the time, I assumed they were simply thinking about my comfort. Now I began to see a different possibility forming in the quiet hours of that night. The next morning sunlight came through the bedroom curtains earlier than usual, casting pale gold across the hardwood floor. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time before standing up, listening to the stillness that filled the hallway outside my room. Mornings had always been my favorite part of the day. For decades, I had started each morning with the same routine. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, the local news playing softly on the television, a few quiet minutes at the dining table while the world outside slowly woke up. That routine felt different now. Not broken exactly, but altered in a way I could not ignore anymore. I poured a cup of coffee and stood near the kitchen window looking out at the street. The neighbor across the road was loading groceries into the trunk of her car. A school bus stopped at the corner, and a group of children climbed aboard, laughing and talking the way children always do when the day feels full of possibility. Watching them reminded me of Daniel when he was young, standing on that same corner with his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder while he waited for the bus every morning. I used to stand at this same window to make sure he boarded safely before leaving for work. Back then, the future seemed simple. Raise your child with patience. Give them every opportunity you can manage. Trust that the values you teach will stay with them. I believed those ideas completely for most of my life. Later that afternoon, I found myself walking slowly through each room of the house, noticing details I had not paid attention to in years. The framed photographs on the hallway wall. Daniel at his high school graduation. Daniel and Olivia on their wedding day. My husband smiling beside the old pickup truck he loved more than anything except his family. Each photograph represented a moment when I felt certain our lives were moving in the right direction. Yet as I stood there looking at those memories, a quiet thought surfaced that I could no longer push aside. What if love alone had never been enough to protect the life I believed we had built together? What if the real mistake was believing that sacrifice automatically creates respect? The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also strangely clear. For the first time I began to understand that the lessons shaping the rest of my life were not going to come from the past I remembered. They were going to come from the truth I was only now beginning to accept. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in the living room where the sunlight always settled around 4 o'clock, the same place my husband used to sit with his newspaper and a cup of black coffee after coming home from work. The armchair across from me still carried the faint indentation from years of use. And for a moment, I could almost picture him there again, leaning back with that quiet patience he always had when life became complicated. My husband, Robert, believed in simple rules. He used to say that respect inside a family should never feel uncertain. You should not have to guess whether you belong in your own home. At the time, those words seemed obvious, almost unnecessary, because our life together had always followed that rule without effort. Robert built this house with his own hands during the summers when Daniel was still a child. I can still remember the smell of fresh lumber and the way Daniel used to run through the empty rooms pretending the house was a castle before the walls were even painted. We did not have much money back then, but we had something that felt more important. We had a sense that we were building something together that would last. After Robert passed away 12 years ago, I held on to that idea as if it were a promise that could not be broken. The house became more than a place to live. It became proof that our family still existed in the way it always had. That belief carried me through the difficult years that followed. But as the afternoon light moved slowly across the carpet, I began to realize how much the world had quietly shifted since those days. I thought about the conversation Daniel and Olivia had started during dinner the night before. At first it sounded like a casual suggestion. Olivia mentioned that property values in the neighborhood had increased over the last few years. Daniel added that larger homes like this one were becoming difficult to maintain for someone living alone. Their voices were calm, careful, almost rehearsed in the way people speak when they are trying to introduce an idea gently. At the time, I had simply listened, assuming they were sharing ordinary concerns about the future. But when I replayed their words in my mind that afternoon, the pieces began to arrange themselves differently. They were not talking about possibilities. They were talking about plans. Olivia had mentioned a real estate agent she knew from work who specialized in properties like this. Daniel had explained that many retirement communities offered smaller homes with less maintenance and convenient services for older residents. The way he described it made it sound practical, responsible even. Yet something in his voice carried a distance I had never heard before. I walked slowly into the hallway and looked again at the photographs that lined the wall. One picture showed Robert and Daniel standing together in the backyard beside the young maple tree we planted the year Daniel turned 10. That tree now towered above the fence outside, tall and strong after decades of steady growth. Looking at that photograph, I suddenly understood why the dinner conversation had unsettled me so deeply. This house had never been just a building. It was the place where our family learned how to exist together. Every room carried the memory of a moment that shaped the life we once shared. The kitchen where Daniel blew out candles on birthday cakes. The living room where Robert and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary with a small group of friends. The front porch where Daniel sat nervously waiting for Olivia to arrive on their first date. Standing there in the quiet hallway, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. The conversation at dinner had not been about the house at all. It had been about whether I still had a place inside the life that continued beyond those walls. And for the first time in many years, I began to understand that the answer might not be what I had always believed. I did not call Daniel that evening, although the thought crossed my mind more than once while the sky outside the windows slowly turned from pale gold to deep blue. Instead, I made a simple dinner for myself and ate quietly at the small corner of the dining table where I had always sat when the house felt too large for one person. The chair across from me remained empty, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine how many dinners Daniel and Olivia had shared together in their own home without ever inviting me. The thought did not make me angry. Not yet. It simply made something inside me feel very still, the way a lake becomes perfectly calm just before a storm begins somewhere far away. After dinner, I washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen lights, leaving only the small lamp glowing in the living room. I sat there for a long time with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house as if it were speaking a language I had only just begun to understand. Around 8:30 my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I studied it carefully before answering. His voice sounded polite, almost cheerful, the way people sound when they are trying very hard to keep a conversation comfortable. He asked how my day had been and whether I had slept well the night before. I answered calmly, giving him the same kind of simple responses I had always given when he called during his busy workdays. Then he cleared his throat in a small, nervous way that I remembered from when he was a teenager, trying to explain something he knew might disappoint me. He said that he and Olivia had been thinking more about the conversation from dinner. According to him, they believed it would be wise for all of us to begin discussing long-term plans. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word as if he were following a script he had rehearsed earlier. He explained that homes like mine were selling quickly in the current market and that the value of the property had increased significantly over the past decade. He also mentioned that several new retirement communities had recently opened about 15 miles outside the city, offering smaller houses, landscaped walking paths, and organized activities for residents. Listening to him describe these places felt strangely distant, as if he were talking about a life that belonged to someone else entirely. I asked him a simple question then. I asked whether he believed I should leave this house. There was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough for the truth to become visible. When he finally answered, his voice sounded softer, but it also carried a firmness that I had never heard directed toward me before. He said that he thought it might be the most practical decision for everyone involved. Practical, the word, settled into the silence between us with a quiet finality. For many years I had believed that the foundation of family decisions was love. That night I began to understand that for some people practicality had replaced that foundation entirely. I thanked Daniel for sharing his thoughts and told him I would think carefully about everything he had said. He seemed relieved by my calm response. Before ending the call, he reminded me that he and Olivia only wanted what was best for me. After the phone went silent, I remained seated in the living room for a long time without moving. Outside, the streetlights illuminated the quiet neighborhood where I had spent most of my adult life. The same maple tree Daniel planted with his father stood tall beside the driveway, its branches stretching across the yard as if they had always belonged there. Looking at that tree, I realized something important. Trees grow strong because their roots remain in the ground that first supported them. People, however, sometimes forget where their roots began. And in that quiet realization, I felt the first clear shift inside my own thinking. For the first time in many years, I stopped asking what my family expected from me. Instead, I began asking what I expected from the life I still had ahead of me. I woke early the next morning before the sun had fully risen, the kind of quiet hour when the entire neighborhood still feels suspended between night and day. The air inside the house felt cool and still as I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water. For years I had followed the same routine without thinking about it. Coffee first, a few minutes by the window, then the slow unfolding of whatever the day happened to bring. That morning the routine felt slightly different, not because anything around me had changed, but because something inside my thinking had shifted during the long hours of the previous night. I carried my cup to the small wooden table beside the window and looked out at the familiar street. A delivery truck moved slowly past the houses, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once before the sound faded into the quiet. It was the same neighborhood I had known for decades, the same sidewalks where Daniel learned to ride his bicycle and the same lawns where neighbors gathered for summer barbecues every year. Yet the sense of certainty I once felt about my place in this life had begun to dissolve. For most of my adult years, I believed stability came from holding on to what you had built. The house, the routines, the relationships that shaped the structure of daily life. I believed that if you protected those things carefully enough, they would protect you in return. But sitting there that morning, watching the pale light spread slowly across the street, I began to see that belief in a new way. Stability was not created by walls or traditions. It was created by people choosing to remain present in each other's lives. Without that choice, even the strongest foundation eventually becomes uncertain. Later that morning, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, something I had not done regularly in years. The sidewalks were damp from the night air, and the maple tree beside the driveway cast long shadows across the grass as the sun rose higher above the rooftops. I walked slowly, noticing small details that had once been so familiar I rarely paid attention to them anymore. The white fence 2 houses down that Mr. Alvarez repainted every spring. The small garden beside the corner house where Mrs. Turner grew bright red roses every summer. These small signs of care and effort reminded me that homes were never just buildings. They were places where people decided, day after day, that their lives mattered enough to maintain. As I turned the corner near the park, I saw an older man sitting on a bench beneath a tall oak tree. For a moment, I did not recognize him, but when he stood and waved in my direction, I realized it was George Miller, an old friend of my husband who still lived a few streets away. George had always been the kind of man who noticed things others overlooked. After a brief greeting, he asked how I had been doing lately. His voice carried the calm steadiness of someone who had spent many years observing the quiet patterns of life. I hesitated before answering, then told him that Daniel and Olivia had recently begun discussing the possibility of selling my house and helping me move somewhere smaller. George listened without interrupting, his eyes resting thoughtfully on the park across the street. When I finished speaking, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he said something simple that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. He said that generosity is a beautiful quality, but it must be balanced with self-respect or it slowly becomes invisible. Those words settled into my mind with a clarity I had not expected. For many years I believed that giving more than you receive is simply part of loving your family. But standing there beneath the tall oak tree, listening to the quiet breeze move through its branches, I began to understand the deeper truth hidden inside George's observation. A life built entirely on sacrifice eventually teaches other people to see that sacrifice is normal. And once something becomes normal, very few people stop to question whether it should have happened at all. I walked home slowly after speaking with George, taking the long path around the park instead of returning directly to the house. The morning had grown brighter, and the neighborhood was beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of daily life. A lawnmower started somewhere down the block. A car door slammed. 2 children rode past on bicycles, laughing as they tried to race each other toward the corner. For a long time, I simply listened to those sounds, allowing them to settle around me like a reminder that life continues whether we understand it fully or not. George's words stayed with me as I walked. Generosity must be balanced with self-respect. The sentence seemed simple when he said it, but the more I thought about it, the more clearly I saw how rarely I had practiced that balance in my own life. I had always believed that giving without hesitation was the clearest sign of love. When Daniel needed help with tuition, I worked extra hours. When he wanted to buy his first home, I offered the savings I had carefully set aside for retirement. Even after he married Olivia, I continued to show my support in quiet ways. Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, little things that I hoped would remind them that this house would always be a place where they belonged. Yet somewhere along the way that generosity had quietly shifted into something else. Instead of strengthening my place in their lives, it had slowly made my presence easier to overlook. By the time I reached my driveway, the realization had settled firmly in my mind. I stood there for a moment looking at the house that had been the center of my world for so many years. The maple tree beside the driveway moved gently in the breeze, its leaves casting small moving shadows across the grass. I remembered the day Robert and Daniel planted that tree together, both of them kneeling in the dirt while I held the young trunk steady so the roots would settle properly into the ground. Robert had smiled at Daniel and told him that strong roots matter more than fast growth. At the time it sounded like simple gardening advice. Now it felt like something deeper. I stepped onto the front porch and opened the door, letting the familiar quiet of the house welcome me inside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish, the same scent that had filled these rooms for decades. But as I moved through the hallway, I felt something new rising in my thoughts. For the first time in a very long while, I was not thinking about how to preserve everything exactly the way it had always been. Instead, I was thinking about what kind of life I still wanted to live. Later that afternoon, I sat at the dining table with a notebook and a pen. The notebook was one I had kept in the kitchen drawer for years, usually used for grocery lists or small reminders. That day, I opened to a blank page and began writing something different. I wrote the first clear lesson I had finally begun to understand. Respect cannot grow in a place where you quietly accept being overlooked. The words looked almost strange on the page at first, as if they belonged to someone wiser than the woman who had spent decades trying to keep peace inside her family. Yet the more I looked at them, the more they felt true. I realized then that learning a lesson is not only about understanding it. It is about allowing that understanding to change the way you move forward. That evening when the sun began to set behind the houses across the street, I closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the table beside me. For the first time since the conversation at dinner, the silence inside the house felt different. It no longer felt like uncertainty. It felt like the quiet space where a new chapter of life was beginning to take shape. I left the notebook open on the table that evening, returning to it several times as the quiet hours of the night slowly unfolded around me. The sentence I had written earlier remained at the top of the page, steady and simple, yet it seemed to change the way I looked at everything inside the house. For decades, I had believed that maintaining harmony meant accepting small discomforts without protest. I believed that patience and kindness would naturally guide relationships back toward balance. But sitting there beneath the soft glow of the kitchen light, I began to understand that harmony built on silence is often mistaken for agreement. When people never hear your boundaries, they eventually assume there are none. The realization did not arrive with anger or bitterness. Instead, it arrived with a calm clarity that felt almost surprising. I closed the notebook for a moment and walked slowly through the house again, not as someone guarding memories, but as someone seeing the place with new eyes. The living room still held the same familiar furniture, the same photographs arranged neatly along the shelves. Yet the room no longer felt like a museum preserving the past. It felt like a space waiting for the next decision I would make about my future. Later that evening, Daniel called again. His voice sounded relaxed, as if the conversation we had shared the night before had already settled comfortably into his understanding of how things would proceed. He asked if I had thought about the ideas he and Olivia mentioned regarding the house and the possibility of moving somewhere smaller. This time I answered without hesitation. I told him that I had indeed spent time thinking about the future. I explained that I understood their concerns about practicality and long-term planning. But I also told him something I had never expressed so clearly before. I told him that this house represented more than square footage or property value. It represented a life I had built with patience, commitment, and care. There was a pause on the line again, though this time it felt different from the one the night before. Daniel asked what that meant for the plans he and Olivia had suggested. I spoke calmly, choosing each word with the same careful clarity I had used when writing in the notebook. I said that decisions about this house would be made by the person who had spent decades maintaining it. I also told him that moving forward, I intended to make choices based on what felt respectful and meaningful for the life I still wished to live. My voice remained steady as I spoke, and to my surprise, the words did not feel confrontational. They simply felt honest. Daniel did not argue. Instead, he said that he understood and that perhaps we could talk more about everything in the coming weeks. When the call ended, I set the phone down beside the notebook and sat quietly for a moment. Outside the windows, the evening had grown dark, and the streetlights cast long reflections across the glass. For many years, I believed that changing the direction of your life required dramatic action or sudden courage. But that night, I began to understand that change often begins with something much smaller. It begins with the moment you decide that your voice deserves to be heard in your own story. I opened the notebook again and wrote another line beneath the first lesson. The second lesson was just as clear as the first. Boundaries are not walls that push people away. They are quiet reminders that your life has value. When I placed the pen down beside the notebook, the silence inside the house felt peaceful rather than uncertain. For the first time in many years, I understood that the future was not something others would decide for me. It was something I was finally ready to shape with my own hands. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm beginning that makes the world feel open and unhurried. I woke before the alarm clock, something that had started happening more often in recent years, and for a few minutes I simply lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The faint creak of the wooden floor as the temperature changed. The distant hum of a car passing somewhere down the street. These small sounds used to remind me how long I had lived here. That morning they reminded me of something different. They reminded me that every day begins with a choice about how we see our own lives. I rose slowly and walked to the kitchen where the early sunlight had begun to spill across the counter. The maple tree outside the window moved gently in the breeze, its leaves catching the light in a way that made the yard feel alive with quiet motion. For years that tree had been a symbol of the life Robert and I built together. Now it felt like something more. It felt like a reminder that growth does not stop simply because time has passed. I made coffee and carried my cup to the dining table, where the notebook still rested exactly where I had left it the night before. The page held the 2 lessons I had written. Respect cannot grow where you quietly accept being overlooked. Boundaries are quiet reminders that your life has value. I read the words slowly, letting them settle into my thoughts again. They no longer felt like discoveries. They felt like foundations. Foundations for the life that still remained ahead of me. That morning I added several more lines beneath the first 2. The 3rd lesson came easily. Love should never require you to disappear in order to keep the peace. The 4th followed soon after. Generosity is strongest when it is given freely, not when it is expected without acknowledgement. Then I paused for a moment before writing the 5th. It is never too late to begin living with clarity about what you deserve. When I finished writing, I closed the notebook and looked around the dining room once more. The same furniture stood in its familiar places. The same framed photographs lined the hallway beyond the doorway. Yet the room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had finally allowed my understanding of life to grow beyond the habits that once defined it. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by the house unexpectedly. He stood on the front porch with the same slightly uncertain expression he used to have as a teenager when he was not quite sure how a conversation would unfold. We sat together in the living room while the afternoon sunlight stretched across the carpet. He asked how I had been feeling since our recent discussions about the future. I answered honestly. I told him that I had spent time reflecting on what matters most during the years that remain in a person's life. I explained that those years deserve to be guided by respect, independence, and clarity. Daniel listened quietly. When I finished speaking, he nodded slowly, as if recognizing that something about our relationship had shifted into a new understanding. There was no argument, no tension, just a quiet recognition that the life I had built was still mine to shape. After he left, I stepped outside onto the porch and looked across the yard where the maple tree stood tall beside the driveway. The late afternoon breeze moved through its branches, carrying a soft rustling sound that felt almost like quiet applause. I realized then that the most powerful lesson of all had nothing to do with houses or plans or expectations from other people. The most powerful lesson was simply this. Your life does not lose its meaning with age. In many ways it becomes clearer. And when you finally understand that truth, you realize that the years ahead are not something to surrender. They are something to live with purpose, dignity, and the quiet confidence that you still belong fully in your own story.